We continue our deep dive series into the win totals of some of the most popular teams in the country. Justin Hopkins of Scoop Duck joins us to talk the Oregon Ducks, who are in a very select club right now. 4 teams have a 10.5 win total at FanDuel. This is the highest in the country. Oregon's one of them. J-Hop, the others are Georgia, Ohio State, and Texas. So I believe that firmly plants Oregon in the expected to compete for the national title zone. Do you think the Ducks are ready to feel that way?
Well, that's certainly some good company to be in. And, I know we'll talk about it, but that certainly makes October 12th, that Ohio State-Oregon game, very intriguing, of course, as we head into it. But, yeah, I do think that the roster's there. If we were still talking about the old Pac-12, I'd feel really good about Oregon. But obviously with things changing and them being a part of the Big Ten, they can compete. And I do think that, I know we'll talk about it, but you have to kind of look at Oregon and Ohio State being 2 of the favorites for the Big Ten early on.
Yeah, I would say they are the favorites and they play each other. So it's going to be fun because I think everybody's assuming, Ohio State and Michigan will play and then there's no division. So they'll just play again the next week. I don't think we should assume that. I think Oregon and Penn State and maybe Washington might have a little something to say about that. So let's talk about Oregon's roster, though. The big move in the offseason is obviously Bo Nix has gone off to the NFL, but Dillon Gabriel comes in from Oklahoma, and that was a situation where Oklahoma had to decide one more year of Dillon Gabriel, or do we start the Jackson Arnold era? They went with the younger guy, and now Dillon Gabriel is in Eugene.
Yeah, it feels, and it's really dangerous to say this because of how good and how efficient Bo Nix was last year, but it really feels plug and play if you're Oregon. I think Will Stein has shown that he has no problem kind of adapting his offense to the strengths of his current quarterback, whether that be Bo Nix, Dillon Gabriel, whatever the case calls there. They've got plenty of weapons at wide receiver. They returned basically the entire offensive line, save Jackson Power Johnson, who rose his stock at the Senior Bowl there this past couple of weeks. So just across the board, offensively, Oregon looks really good, and defensively, they brought a lot of those guys back as well. So if you're looking for a team with balance and talent and depth, I think Oregon checks all 3 of those boxes.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like it's as big of a defensive overhaul as it was last year. It seemed like Dan Lanning, especially after the Oregon State game in 22, was like, okay, we are changing the personnel on defense. This roster is gonna look a little different. It seems like it's kind of more spot work, like Jabbar Muhammad, the corner from Washington, who's one of those too good to not grab if you can get him.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think for the most part, Oregon did fill a few holes on the defensive side of the ball. But like you said, a guy like Jabbar Muhammad, we got to go get that guy no matter what. And they had just, gotten Cam Alexander to transfer from UTSA a week or 2 before. Like you said, Muhammad is too good to pass up. I think Kobe Savage is another guy that Oregon feels really good about.
Okay.
I think safety. Yeah, I think safety is where they needed help the most, and they certainly did a lot of work there. But along the defensive line, they were in great shape, and they didn't pursue anybody at linebacker in the transfer portal because they had a good feeling, or they pushed really hard for Justin Jacobs to come back and Jeffrey Bassa. I mean, returning those 2 guys is monster for Oregon.
Yeah, and it does feel like in the trenches they're in a pretty good spot because you have the older guys who were recruited by Mario Cristobal, and then Dan Lanning's done a good job of supplementing those guys, like a Johnny Cornelius coming from Rhode Island, and now in year 2 at Oregon.
Yeah, and Jordan Birch came back. That's mean, we're kind of not really talking about it, and it's kind of like he is coming back. There's a lot of upside with him, and a guy that could play into the early rounds. He wouldn't have been an early rounder had he come out this year, but he'll come back, and he was a real force in the last 3 to 4 weeks for Oregon, possibly even outplaying Brandon Dorlus down the stretch. So yeah, I mean, again, if we're checking all the boxes, they're good in the trenches on both sides of the ball. They've got skill and talent. They've got speed. They've got guys that have played in the system and guys that are returning. So now it's just really kind of getting Dillon Gabriel up to speed and getting some of those guys to really step into those vacant leadership roles and take it from there.
Well, and also Will Stein's back, which I know it sounds crazy because he's only been there a year, but you saw when Kenny Dillingham got there, did well, became a head coach. Will Stein, there was a lot of noise around him in the coaching carousel. He's viewed as a future head coach, future star. And so the fact that they do have him back for another year is probably pretty beneficial.
Yeah, you were able to return, both coordinators, all three coordinators, however you want to see it. But obviously they promoted Chris Hampton, secondary coach / co-DC. Tosh Lupoy returns. And like you said, Will Stein is back. And that's something a little bit different from Dan Lanning. We forget he's only in year 3, but he's already on his second offensive coordinator because Dillingham lasted a year and got the ASU job, which was great for him. I think Will Stein, I know I mentioned this just a moment ago about Jordan Birch, but I think Will Stein, we kind of saw him coming into his own about halfway into the season. And I don't think he was bad to start. I think there was just some things he was testing out, figuring out, and finding out about the team and about himself. And I think the play calling down the stretch for him was as good as it could get. And, an off season for him with this team is probably going to be very good for Dan Lanning and the Ducks.
So let's dig into this 10.5, because to go over, there's little margin for error. Basically, it's probably the Ohio State game, or you got to win that game, and then you get a gimme somewhere else. But let's look at this thing, because it starts out looking very familiar to Oregon fans. You got Idaho, Boise State, Oregon State in a different part of the calendar, but it's still a game in Corvallis, and then UCLA. So that's September. That feels like an Oregon schedule from basically any other year other than Oregon State being so early.
Yeah, it's going to be, I've been doing this for a long time, and for myself, I'm having a tough time wrapping my head around, okay, this is the new schedule. These are the new games. Obviously, the rivalry game remains with Washington, which is great. But yeah, seeing Oregon State basically what would be your first Pac-12 game, that will be unique. That game is traditionally always, played in late November, where it's really cold or really foggy or really rainy or all three. So
Yep.
It'll be kind of unique to see it probably like 75, 80 degrees and more than likely sunny out. And then you enter into the Big Ten era with UCLA. So it's just kind of,
which is, it's not, that doesn't even feel like a Big Ten game. Like, leave the Pac-12 jerseys or Pac-12 patches on the jersey for that week. And then the following week, Sparty shows up and it's like, oh, this is different.
Then it's chaos from there. Yeah. The only thing different about that UCLA game is that obviously no Chip Kelly. So that will be a little bit unique.
That is going to be strange. And now Michigan State comes in, and I'm feeling very old because I was like, well, I just covered a Michigan State Oregon home and home series. I covered the game in East Lansing, and I'm like, oh wait, that was 2015. That was 9 years ago. So it's been a while since these two have seen each other. Obviously, Michigan State played Washington the past couple of years, but that's one with a familiar face, though. Jonathan Smith will bring Michigan State to Eugene, where he coached in Eugene last year.
Yeah. No, that one almost feels more like the Michigan or the Oregon State game than the actual Oregon State game. Obviously, Trent Bray there, we'll see what he's able to do with that roster, which looks a little depleted. And then, you've got Jonathan Smith coming back. He's going to know, Oregon better than probably anybody in the Big Ten. He's going to be familiar with Eugene. So that's going to have a very, very interesting feel for sure this year.
And then the next week, October 12th, the big one, maybe possibly the biggest regular season game in the whole country this year. We'll see. I think Georgia and Texas might have some say in that as well. But Ohio State comes to Eugene, which feels like the first kind of signature game of the new Big Ten.
Well, it's set up pretty interesting. It's full circle. Obviously, Oregon went and played Ohio State in Columbus and won with Mario Cristobal, a very intense game. Ohio State wasn't able to make it out to Eugene originally from that series, and now here it comes full circle. Oh, and to boot, by the way, Chip Kelly's going to be calling the offense for Ohio State when they come. So I will say this: if there's any Ohio State fans, I know the Oregon fans will know this. If there's any Ohio State fans planning on coming to that game, book whatever hotel or Airbnb you can get early, because there will not be any come August or September. I guarantee you that.
Yeah, you were going to have to sleep outdoors. Like
Oh
you're gonna
yeah.
have to find a spot on the Prefontaine Trail if you go camping. But yeah, this is exciting though, because the Chip Kelly thing only adds another layer to what was already a really fun game, because this is going to be two of the most talented rosters in the country. I imagine that Ohio State offense is going to be really good, because the idea of Chip Kelly, and we've seen Will Howard at Kansas State. We know what he can do, but we've never seen him with that level of talent around him. I think it could be fun, and it really does set the tone for the race in the Big Ten. I think everybody's watching that, and whoever wins that has the advantage going forward in the whole league, because Michigan's got a lot to deal with. They're bringing back some, but not a lot, from the national championship team. Penn State, new coordinators on both sides of the ball. We'll see, but man, it's something. Now, no crazy weird storylines for at Purdue or Illinois coming, but that's the other thing is, like, do you wonder sometimes, J-Hop, like, which Big Ten team is going to be the one that they're like, oh, we hate playing those guys? Like, who's it going to be?
Yeah, who's going to be the thorn in the side? Because anytime previously when Oregon has gone to play in the desert, and whether that's been at ASU or against Arizona, it's just had a hex over Oregon. Always has. I mean, they've managed to win some, they've managed to lose some. They totally shouldn't. And so, yeah, you kind of wonder, like, okay, where's the death zone going to be now for Oregon? Is it going to be in Indiana? Could it be up in Michigan? Could it be somewhere? It's just, Rutgers could catch you. I think there's one, and I know we'll get to it, but there's one on this list that kind of has me a bit worried, and I guess we'll.
I think I know which one it is. But first, let's go to Ann Arbor.
Yeah,
November 2nd. And Ann Arbor, I think Ann Arbor has a special place in Oregon history.
yes,
because it was the first place everybody realized how special that Chip Kelly offense was, his first year as OC. Now, Michigan was coming off losing to Appalachian State, and I think that Oregon game made it look even worse because people were like, oh, well, they're just getting destroyed by No. This was a special offense that nobody was prepared for. But now they're coming in. They may be favored in this game, and it's the defending national champs.
Yeah, I mean, 3 weeks ago, we're talking about a different game, I think. Obviously Harbaugh leaves, go to the NFL. Of course, they promote Sharon Moore, which I think most of us expected they needed to do. So now you wonder, what does this Michigan team look like? What's their identity? Of course, Sharon Moore did a terrific job with that team in Harbaugh's absence, but this is a different animal. This is not filling in for 3 or 4 games or whatever the case might be. This is your team, your identity. And not to mention, they lost a lot of really good coaches and coordinators on that staff. So I think probably yourself and many others like me, just kind of wondering what Michigan team you're going to see this year. I don't think that they rebuilt in a way that makes them a contender like they are, but it's certainly a team that you can't overlook. And I'm sure there's many Michigan fans that would love to get a little bit of vengeance for that beatdown, Dennis Dixon, Chip Kelly, and those guys did on him.
God, Dennis Dixon getting hurt. That was against Arizona too, right? That was not in the desert, but the desert came to Eugene that day. That's going to be fun. And I think the Sharon Moore personality, or the desired personality of that team, should feel pretty familiar to Dan Lanning and company, because it's exactly what they want Oregon to be.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think he'll do a great job. I think those are, we're talking about kind of circling back. Oregon and Ohio State very much feels like Oregon and Washington last year, almost at the same time in the schedule. 2 teams that are looking like top 5 teams, easily top 10 teams. And you kind of come out of that game thinking, all right, this is a tone setter, in college football and in the conference. And then, of course, there was other games that Oregon had to go on to win, after Washington. And Michigan feels like, hey, look, if you are able to get past Ohio State, or if you lose a close one to Ohio State, you got to go and beat Michigan. And that's going to be a tough one for sure.
So I think this is the one you were talking about, where this might be the thorn in the side. And this, going to Madison, Wisconsin in November, is probably a lot like going to the desert. The Badgers, I'm very intrigued to see the Badgers this year, because I don't think Luke Fickell would have taken that job if he didn't think there was a capability of them eventually being able to compete for the Big Ten title. They definitely needed to upgrade the speed on the roster based on what we saw last year. Like you saw them come to Washington State. They looked like they couldn't separate at receiver. If they can, there's a chance they can beat just about anybody.
Yeah, that was the game. You're exactly right. Didn't tip that off to you, but you picked up on it. I'm going to be honest. One of my bucket list items in the new Big Ten era, the new college football Pac-12. That's a place I'm excited to go watch a football game at. I know it's a lively atmosphere, and that's the tremendous part about college football are those atmospheres. And like you said, this is a November game. This is going to be pretty much uncharted territory. I agree with you. I think Wisconsin's a team that we all kind of maybe have circled or just like, hey, question mark, is this going to be the year? Is this a team? And I think they'll be a thorn in a lot of people's sides. So yeah, that Wisconsin game, if we're talking about which one are you kind of most worried about outside of the obvious ones, I think that might be it.
Now, fortunately for Oregon, they do get a week between that and the Washington game, which closes the regular season. But they are now no more Kalen DeBoer, which is probably great for Oregon because they were 0-3 against Kalen DeBoer Washington teams. But this is a monkey they got to get off their back.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of one of those things you walk into it maybe a little bit nervous, and you shouldn't, because you know that if you look at talent-wise, if you look at everything else, recruiting, all that, Oregon in spades is in much better position than Washington. But yeah, you're 0-3 against Washington. You need to get this monkey off your back. More than likely, as we both expect, Oregon's going to be playing for a lot on the line. Washington very well could be as well. I don't know that roster. It's just seen a lot of change. So we'll see what they're able to do up there. But yeah, it's kind of a game that's like, it really ultimately feels like Oregon loses that game badly or beats the brakes off Washington, and there's no in between.
Well, and win total aside, let's say Oregon does drop one, whether they drop one to Ohio State or drop one elsewhere. The idea of Oregon coming into that game with one conference loss, where if they win it, they're probably in the Big Ten championship game. If they lose it, they're probably out. I mean, that could be a really heavy version of this rivalry, which is now moved to the the prime rivalry spot at the end of the season, as opposed to the Oregon State game. So now I want to ask you, J-Hop, Oregon State fans will have their own opinions on this, but Oregon fans, do they like that Washington looks like the primary rival now as opposed to Oregon State?
Yeah, I think so. It's a very tough thing to do because of the in-state rivalry and it being over 100 years old and it being so storied. But yeah, the blood and the anger and everything about college football that makes it great, it's Oregon and Washington, right? It hasn't been Oregon and Oregon State. It's been Oregon and Washington. And I love the fact that Oregon and Oregon State were able to figure out a way to continue making that game happen. No, it doesn't carry the same end of season kind of weight that it has, but Washington should be there, especially now that they are in the same conference with Oregon. It just makes so much more sense. And I agree. If you ask any Oregon fan who's the bigger rival, they're gonna say Washington 9 out of 10 times.
Well, it is pressure on, because the expectations are there. And this is, Dan Lanning's been building to this. This is what he wanted, but now he's got it. One of the favorites to compete for the national title, the Oregon Ducks. Can they go over 10.5? It will not be easy. Thank you, J-Hop.
No problem. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples On 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.